Okay, people, let's take a look at part 2, forms of government. This segment of the introduction to government terms will be shorter than the previous segment. It won't run as long. However, it's going to bring I'm going to bring in things that you're probably not familiar with, things that you haven't been accustomed to, parliamentary, unitary, federal, things that you might not understand. So I think what I'll do is I'll introduce more links so that I can help you to understand this stuff. Yeah, so let's get forward. Now, we talked earlier about dictatorship and democracy. I want to touch base on dictatorship and democracy again. And the fact, and just to re-emphasize that there are different kinds of dictatorships. There's autocracies, there's oligarchies, there's religious dictatorships, there's communist dictatorships. There's different labels for dictatorships. But at the end of the day, a dictatorship is that the will of the people is not of primary importance. It is the ruling group or the ruling individual that makes decisions. Now, that doesn't mean that a dictatorship won't have all the machinery of a government. I mean, a dictatorship still has a legislative branch. A dictatorship still has an executive branch because the executive is the entire dictatorship. It still has a judicial branch. But the difference with a dictatorship is that these branches are controlled by the dictator. They are not subjected to the will of the people and democratic vote. They are basically, they're there for looks. Okay, you have a legislative branch that meets. You have legislators, you have representatives, but they're not representatives of the people. They are puppets of the dictator. So the dictator has a Congress that meets, but they just rubber stamp what the dictator wants. If they don't, then they will be out of a job and most likely in prison. The judiciary, which is the third branch of government, which deals with interpreting the Constitution, interpreting the law, is also at the will of the dictatorship. I mean, it's not like they can truly interpret when they are subjected to the displeasure and the imprisonment of the dictatorship. I will say, however, in dictatorships, when there is trouble and things start to crack, that the crack normally comes out of the judicial branch. I think it's possibly because lawyers, even in a country that is an autocracy, a country that has a dictatorship, are still lawyers. They still study the law, and there can still be people that believe in justice, only they subject their feelings of justice and their studies and academia of justice to the situation that they live in. When they get to a point where there are cracks in the foundation of the dictatorship, it is out of this judiciary, judges and lawyers who are first to challenge, as opposed to the legislative branch, which is just politicians and who are there to merely rubber stamp the needs and the will of the dictator. And so whatever kind of dictatorship you have, you still will have a constitution. You still will have a legislative branch. You still will have a judicial branch. You still will have an executive branch, although they are all encompassed inside of the dictatorship. And in public interest only lines up with public policy when it is at the advantage of the dictatorship. So when we talk about countries like North Korea, and I want to show you this video here. Let's watch this little video about North Korea. Okay, this is a legislative branch. in an autocratic regime in North Korea. And so you still have the levers, you still have the machinery, the infrastructure of a government, the same as a democratic government, but this group, they don't make any public policy. All they do is stand and cheer at command. And if they don't stand and cheer at command, then they are removed and placed in prison. It's that easy.
친애하는 대표자 동지들, 오늘 우리는
Okay, let's take this just a step further. You walk through the marbled hallways of the U.S. Congress in Washington, D.C. It's similar to walking through the marbled hallways of the North Korean Workers' Party Congress in Pyongyang. And so these similarities, these machineries, these separations, the different branches between a dictator and a democracy, on the outside, they are similar. Here, take a look.
This is where the 7th Workers' Party Congress of Korea is being held. We went through about a 90-minute security check before boarding buses. We got a police escort. We walked through very ornate marble hallways into this waiting area, and now we're about to head inside, we believe, to see the closing events of the first Workers' Party Congress in 36 years. This is the first time that Western media has been allowed into an event of this caliber here in North Korea. This is a highly secretive country, and in this room are 3,400 people who are the ruling elite, members of the Workers' Party who are voting in the 7th Party Congress, and they're waiting for the Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un and top party leaders to take the stage. We're only allowed to film for about 10 minutes, and we learned the party has created a new, bigger title for their leader, chairman. So it's hard to imagine how much more power you can give to someone who already holds absolute power here in North Korea. You see framed portraits of North Korea's founder and president Kim Il-sung, his son called the great leader Kim Jong-il, and the current leader, the supreme leader Kim Jong-un. And when you walk down these ornate marble halls, you realize that all of this whole building, this country, is built around the image of these three leaders.
So ornate marble halls exist in Pyongyang, in North Korea, as they exist in London, England, as they exist in Ottawa, Canada, as they exist in the United States and Washington, D.C. And then we talk about countries like China, which claims to be a communist dictatorship. It's not communist. It is an authoritarian dictatorship using the terminology of communism to create an illusion of communism. The same with Vietnam, the same with Cuba. These are not communist dictators. These are not communist countries. These are dictatorships. Russia, while it has machinery to re-elect Vladimir Putin, that machinery is so limited that it by all intents and purposes, is a dictatorship. I want to show you also now this Freedom House thing, because the Freedom House rates the democracy of countries. And so I will go through and I'll show you how different countries are rated. You'll be surprised that the United States is not the highest rated democracy in regards to civil liberties and civil rights in the world. In fact, it's rather average in regards to the first world countries. Okay, this is Freedom House. Freedom House works to defend human rights and promote democratic change with a focus on political rights and civil liberties. We act as a catalyst for freedom through a combination of analysis, advocacy, and action. Our analysis focuses on 13 central issues is underpinned by our international program work. Browse our work and analysis by issues below. So you have all of these issues: authoritarian reach, election integrity, media freedom. Media freedom is a big one. Equality and human rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, religious freedom, democracy during a pandemic. All of these issues are considered when Freedom House does these rankings of countries around the world in regard to their level of democracy. This is fully accepted by educational outlets, by universities and political science departments around the country. Now, with that in mind, take a look at this, okay? Because what it does is it takes all of the states of the world and provides them a ranking on up to 100 on their level of democracy. So here, up here in Scandinavia, remember we've talked about Scandinavia and the level of voting in Scandinavia, in the accountability that the government has to their populace. 100 out of 100 in Norway, 100 out of 100 in Sweden, 100 out of 100 in Finland. All throughout Europe, Germany 94, France 90, Spain 92. You come over to Japan, 96, Australia 97, Canada 98, all out of 100. High levels of democracy. United States 86 out of 100. See, we have this thought that the United States is the democratic city on the hill, the beacon of liberty to the world, and that is just not true. We've got a lot of holes in our democracy. It's not like we are China, 10 out of 100. It's not like we're North Korea, it's 3 out of 100. Or Cambodia, or Myanmar, 30 out of 100. You know Iran is low, 17 out of 100. Syria is a mess, 30. Iraq, Syria is 0 out of 100. Cuba, 14 out of 100. But you know what? The United States at 86 out of 100 on issues such as this, issues such as these, we have problems in our democracy. We have a long ways to go. A lot of them are structural, a lot of them are constitutional, a lot of them deal with voting and the fact that we limit voting rights. And this last election is a good example of how and why the United States has its weaknesses, huge weaknesses in regards to being a democratic state in the world. Meanwhile, I will move forward. So we do now understand the difference between a dictatorship and a democracy. Dictatorship is not the will of the people. A democracy is, however, it can be a republic, as in most democracies in the world, where you elect individuals who then represent the will of the people, or it can be a direct democracy in which the people actually do their own representation. That's really difficult to do when you get into the numbers that you have in countries around the world. We have representative democracies on the planet, and these are normally the wealthiest countries in the world as well. And okay, now let's look at the next thing, which would be the geographic distribution of power in different countries of the world. You have 3 different routes that you can go here. You can have a unitary government, a confederate government, or a federal government. What do these things mean? This is only where the power is located within the institution of government. Okay, if you have a unitary unit, the word unit, the word unitary, this means that it's all located in one place. The unitary government is, boom, right there, one spot. So the United States obviously isn't a unitary government because we have 50 state governments. So we're not unitary. If we were a unitary government, then you would see Washington, D.C. as the only location of political power in the United States. And come on, think, in a country our size, that'd be crazy. That'd be crazy. That's not logical. It's not effective. You'd have to have a small country. I think Costa Rica is a unitary government. I think Costa Rica, I would guess maybe France, because it's small and Paris is there smack in the middle, is a unitary government. So in France, you have a unitary government. Everything radiates out like the sun, zoom, from Paris. The sun is Paris, all the power radiates from Paris. But for any country of size, that would make no sense at all. It would be impossible to get things done. It's like a sun out of Washington, D.C. Can you imagine it reaching to the outer edges of the U.S., of the state, of the United States? Or can you imagine Ottawa, Canada, reaching out to the edges from Newfoundland to British Columbia? Can you imagine Washington, D.C. ruling everything from Maine to New Mexico, from Hawaii, for God's sakes, Hawaii to Alaska to Florida to Michigan? It wouldn't work. That's a unitary government. I think a unitary government is probably really effective in a small country, probably more effective than any other form of government. This is geographic distribution. Another one would be a confederate government. That's where all of the power of the government is distributed out into the satellites, into the provinces. So what you would have in the United States is you would have 50 states, 50 separate state governments, 50 separate state governments with no Washington, D.C. at the center. That can be a mess because you have conflict. That's a confederacy. You have a confederate form of government. There are no effective confederate forms of government that I know of. The EU, the European Union, is a secondary government that loosely brings all of the states of Europe together under a confederation. But the I mean, it's just too many conflicts with too many separate governments. Michigan would be in conflict constantly with Ohio and Indiana on different issues unless you had an overriding central government that would solve political problems, that would come in and handle those things. And so Confederate governments just don't work. The United States was a Confederate government at one time. I would say probably right after the American Revolution. You had 13 separate provinces. The 13 colonies had turned into states. They were called states in the United States, but we know that they were provinces. And that made up the United States of America. Well, they did not. Once Britain was gone and the election was over, they did not get along. They had all sorts of separate coinages. They were fighting over the boundaries, moving to the west. Virginia wanted to write its own peace treaty with Britain after the war. Some of them had navies. It was an absolute Confederate mess. In fact, the guiding constitution for the United States in the early years was the Articles of Confederation, which was just that. It was 13 separate entities, 13 separate provinces, 13 separate states brought together under a loose confederation. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. It's like having planets with no sun. Unitary is a sun with no planets. What is a collaboration between the two, and what Canada is and the United States is and Russia is, because they're big, is a federal government. Okay? A federal government has central power, Washington, D.C., with 50 separate state governments around it, which work simultaneously, sometimes in conflict, sometimes together. But eventually, when push comes to shove, the federal government rises over and makes the decision that unifies the entire the entire institutions of the governments together. And so this is what the United States is. And so this is what Canada is. This is what Russia is. We have federal governments. We have a power source geographically centered in Washington, D.C. We have power sources all over the United States. And it's funny, you look at these things. If you look at the layout of Washington, D.C., and you look at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., boom, you look at it, come to Lansing. Look at the Capitol building. It's modeled after the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Go to Sacramento, California. Guess what? Their Capitol building looks like the one in Washington, D.C. Probably. Maybe it doesn't. Some of them are weird. Some of them are different. But for the most part, it is a setup that is modeled after D.C. So here come the states. After the first 13, the states starts to pop into this federal government. And they set up constitutions that are similar to the U.S. constitutions. They set up a tripartite government that is similar to the U.S. federal national government. And so you have a national government with state governments side by side. And so you have the president. What's the equal of the president? The governor. You have a U.S. Supreme Court. What's the equal of in Michigan? Boom, the Michigan State Supreme Court. You have a Congress in Washington, D.C. What do you have in Lansing? A Congress. And where do they meet? In a Capitol Dome that looks exactly like the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. So this geographic distribution is kind of a cut and paste around the 50 states, only they are free under the 10th Amendment of the Constitution to do their own thing to a certain extent until it runs into the 14th Amendment, or until it runs into the First Amendment, until the Supreme Court says that they can't, like they did with segregation and Brown v. Board. So push comes to shove. It is that the central government that overrides the separate state governments. It's like, and I will show you a very interesting little video that lays this out. You never thought pork sausage would be so political, did you? Where you got the sun in the middle and the states circling happily around the sun with their Jimmy Dean pure pork.
Guys, remember, we're a solar system. Ours is down, and it's only 10 a.m. Who hasn't had their Jimmy Dean breakfast this morning? Now let's orbit.
I feel awesome.
You're all awesome.
Jimmy Dean breakfast sandwiches. Fight the morning fade. Jimmy Dean, shine on.
Who would have thunk? Who would have thunk that Jimmy Dean pure pork sausage would be the perfect example of a federal government? We've talked about the geographic distribution of power. Let's talk about the relationship between the legislative and executive branches. See, in the United States, we have a presidential government. And I think that what happens is that all Americans believe that everybody has a presidential government, but they don't. Many democracies have a parliamentary system. The parliamentary system is different from the presidential system. And I think at the end of this discussion, you might even consider, because of the partisanship that we have in this country, that a parliamentary system might be more beneficial to our democracy. Because the parliamentary system is necessitated on multiple parties. And we have two. And those two parties are so diametrically opposed and partisan with one another that we don't seem to get a whole lot done, do we? We're not getting much done in this country. We have anger, hate. Republicans and Democrats. That's got to change. That's got to change if we're going to move forward. So Let us continue. What is this relationship between, in a presidential government, between the executive and the legislative branch? Well, they're separate. In 1787, when the founders wrote up the Constitution of the United States, they were extremely afraid of power, of delegating too much power, particularly to the executive branch, to a president. Remember that's one of the big reasons for the Electoral College, that this idea that we just left a king and we don't want another king, that what we need to do is we need to make sure that there is all these checks and balances on this executive, on the president, so he can't wield too much power in our government. And so what they set up is a situation where the legislative branch, Congress, which meets in the in the Capitol building in the United States, was made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives, is separate from the president, who lives in the White House. They have physical residences that are separate. That there is this separation of powers that's at the base of the Constitution. There's a separation of powers and all sorts of compromises to limit power of the executive branch. Consequently, the President of the United States has a 4-year term. The Congress of the United States has the House of Representatives, which has 2-year terms. So there are 435 individuals in the House of Representatives based on population. In every 2 years, they are up for re-election. Then you have the Senate, which has 100 members. That's based on 2 per state. They are 6-year terms, and 1/3 of them rotate through every 2 years. So what you end up having is a 4-year term for the president, 2-year terms for the House of Representatives, and 6-year terms for the senators of the United States. So as Donald Trump and Joe Biden were both up in 2020 for the election of the presidency, all 435 House of Representative seats were up for election, and 33 of the Senate seats were up for re-election. So that's how that works. Now, what is the purpose of that? The purpose of that is that you have a separate entity in the White House, a separate entity in the presidency from the Congress. And it separates the powers. But what's happened in our country is these powers have become so separated that not only do they not provide too much power for any one branch, although I would argue in a minute here, I will, that it's actually by default given too much power to the presidency. Not only do they limit power, but they straitjacket. They keep Congress from moving in a direction. And that is really problematic. That is really problematic. And so when you have Congress stops and can't get anything done, then the executive branch, the president, as with Donald Trump this in these last 4 years, issues executive order, executive order, executive order, executive order. And all these executive orders last for the duration of his presidency. It is really gone to the point where it's straitjacketed the process, and there's so little getting done in our Congress. Now, what is a parliamentary system? Whole different deal. Instead of the primary executive being a president separated totally from and being elected totally separate from the legislative branch, the prime minister, who is the head of state, like the president of the United States, the prime minister of England, the prime minister Trudeau of Canada, is the head of the party. And he is elected with the party. So whatever party is in power in that state, in Canada, if the Labour Party has the majority, they have as their leader Justin Trudeau. And he is the executive as long as they can get legislation passed. They have to have over 50% in order to pass legislation. He leads that legislation. He leads that that work inside of the legislative branch until they can't pass legislation, until they have something big comes up and they can't pass it. And then they say, ta-da, boom, we have a broken government. They reshuffle the cards and they hand them back out again and they revote to see if if there's a no confidence vote in the prime minister, and the prime minister can't wield his majority in Congress, then they call it a no confidence vote and they reshuffle and they revote. And then, so how long can a prime minister stay in power? As long as he can wield the majority to get things passed. It is set up to get things passed. You have the majority until you don't have the majority. Then you could put another prime minister in and try again, or you throw everything out and revote totally, in which the minority might win. It seems complicated, but it's not. On the left, you see the United States. You have a presidential democracy. So the voters, the orange people, they are going to vote at the same time for the president, the chief executive, and the legislative branch. We just got done with that. We had all 435 representatives up for vote. We had 33 senators up for vote, and we had a president up for vote. The president stays in for 4 years, the House of Representatives 2 apiece, and Senate for 6. In the rule separately. So you have a separation between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and sometimes they conflict and sometimes they work together. But the legislative branch itself is separate, and so you have Democrats and Republicans in it, and they have to work together to get legislation passed. Now go over to the parliamentary system. A wholly different deal here. So the voters choose the legislative branch only. The legislative branch chooses the chief executive. So the chief executive, which is the equal of the president, the prime minister is equal to the president. The chief executive leads the legislative branch. And so if they have a majority, and they must have a majority to rule, they can't rule without a majority, then they can get stuff done. The legislative branch brings up laws, the chief executive signs the laws, the chief executive leads the legislative branch. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, leads the Labour Party in the legislative branch in Canada, and they get stuff done until they don't get stuff done and they don't have the confidence of the people. Then they throw the cards back in and they reshuffle the deck. It works. And the thing that makes it work are multiple parties. And at the end of the day, I think that maybe the biggest breakdown in the United States is this two-party system. George Washington, in his final address to Congress, warned America about political parties. And why? Well, because Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson hated each other. Those were the two major parties, the Federalists and the Democrat Republicans under Washington. And they were both in his cabinet in the first term. And there was so much animosity between those two parties. And what we have now, and things have changed, there was no Republican Party until Abraham Lincoln. On comes the Republicans. You had Federalists came and went. Whigs came and went. You had different parties. And now we're set on two parties. We're set on Democrats and Republicans. And they're diametrically opposed. They will not work together. There is no bipartisanship. So how do you get anything done? Well, what you have in in these other countries, in England, in Russia, in Germany, France, and Canada, is they have multiple parties, lots of parties. Lots of parties. I mean, I will show you a little video here of multiple parties in different countries. But let me give it to you theoretically. Okay, let's say that I don't know. Labor is always the left party, the Democratic Party, and conservatives is always the right party, the Republican Party. But then they have all these other parties in between. There's always a Green Party, which focuses primarily on the environment. There are multiple versions of labor, multiple versions of conservatives. I think Russia is 70, 80, 90, 100 parties. Usually what a country will have, if it has a parliamentary system, is about 6 to 8 parties that have a little bit of power. You know, they have a little bit of you can vote for them. You can vote for them. And if you vote for them and they get enough, and they have enough people in their party, then they get representatives to Congress. And if they get representatives to Congress, then the ruling majority has to go to these minor parties and ask them to come in to this coalition to give them over 50%. So let's say the Labor Party in Canada has 42% of the vote, would be like the Democrats. And in order and Justin Trudeau is their prime minister. So if they win, if they get a majority, then Justin Trudeau will be the prime minister. They announce it at the onset. Well, let's say the Green Party has, 8%. So they have 40% and they have 8% with the Green Party. Maybe they have a party that is a constitutional, let's say that it is a young people's party, because it's primarily deals with issues that young people like. So let's say that is 2%. So you got 40% and 8% and 2%, that's 50%. And then you've got let's call it a maple leaf party that all worships the biggest and the best and the coolest red flag in the world. And that is 6%. Now you've got 56% of the 100% of people in this ruling coalition that the Labor Party, because they have the biggest number, gets to choose the prime minister, and they go forward. And everybody in that party votes for what Labor wants. But in order for Labor to get those other parties, they have to make concessions. They have to promise. To the Green Party, they promise that they will support environmental issues. To the Young People's Party, they promise that they will support, cost of college issues. To the Maple Leaf Party, to the flag, they say that we will put that cool freaking giant flag on everything. And so they get this ruling coalition, and this ruling coalition moves forward, and it is the government until it isn't the government anymore. How long? Could be 2, could be 4 years, could be 6 years, 8 years, 10 years. It depends how long they are popular with the people, the will of the people, and they fulfill the public interest. Okay, here you go. This is a distribution of seats in the German Bundestag as of January 2020. Now, the German Bundestag is the equal of the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress seats 435 members, the Bundestag 709. But instead of just Democrats and Republicans, look at this breakdown. You have the Christian Democratic Union Party with 246 seats. That's 35% of the Bundestag. They're in black. In red, you have the Social Democratic Party, 21%, 152 seats of the Bundestag. They're in red. You have the Alternative for Germany Party, 89 seats, which is 13%. You have the Free Democratic Party, 11%, the Left Party, 9%, and the Greens, 9%. So this is the 6 parties that make up the Bundestag. Instead of 2, they have 6. There's other multiple parties in Germany as well, but they didn't gain enough seats in the election to get representative seats inside of the Bundestag. But with 6, come on, think. You don't get a majority unless you have 50%. So the leading party, which is the Christian Democratic Union Party, has 35%. They have to find a coalition. They have to find parties where the number of the party seats adds up to over 50% of the 709 seats in the Bundestag. Then they have a majority. Then they have a criteria of goals that they have laid out in the Congress or the Bundestag. And they choose their leader. The leader will come out of the Christian Democratic Union Party because it has the largest majority. That leader will be Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel has been, I think for going on 10, 12 years now, maybe longer, the Prime Minister of Germany. And she has been from this ruling party, the Christian Democratic Union Party. But they're only 35% of the Bundestag. They have to. They must work within the system. They must find allies. They must come together and make concessions. By doing that, you come up with, you make progress. You make progress that way, which is something that it doesn't happen in the United States. And how long can Angela Merkel stay the prime minister? As long as the Christian Democrats control the Bundestag with a majority of seats and work within the system to gain a majority within the Congress itself. That's how the system works. And it does work. It isn't frozen by inactivity. When the Christian Democrats and Angela Merkel can no longer claim that they are moving in a direction, there will be a reshuffle. And who knows, maybe the Social Democratic Party will gain more seats and become the majority party. It's interesting, too, to look at. And you realize here, in this case, the Greens have 9%. But you think about the whole deal with climate change. My guess is throughout Europe, the Green parties are growing. And I think the Green parties are growing with young people because of the threat of climate change. And I think the Greens will gain a larger and larger role inside of these congressional houses throughout Europe and exert more influence on the final on the final plan that the majorities put forward in the separate Congresses. So this whole idea of a parliamentary system is so much more focused on being in tune to the public interest, particularly if a public interest is awake. It's really, it's important that you're awake. And if you are, then you have multiple parties. If you have multiple parties, then you're not going to say, I hate the Democrats and I hate the Republicans, so I'm not going to vote. I'm going to vote for a party that I care about, and it's going to maybe work its way into the ruling coalition. Or I'm going to vote for the libertarians who in the United States are worthless. Vote for the libertarians in the United States. A third party is just a throwaway vote. It might make you feel good at the polls, but it doesn't do anything about public policy. So this idea of a parliamentary system is pretty cool. It's pretty cool. I want you to understand it. I do. Will it happen in the United States? Probably not. Why? Because the two parties in the United States, the Democrats and Republicans, have so much freaking money. Why would the Democrats allow in a third party? Why would the Republicans allow in a third party? They won't. When you think about it, they actually survive by creating hatred of the opposite side. What is the incentive for the Democrats to work with the Republicans or the Republicans to work with the Democrats? They're better off if people hate the other side and then they vote for them. I mean, God, it's just become, it's like we have our feet in concrete in this two-party system, which is awash in money, dominates a system of government that isn't working, with a constitution that's way too old that isn't working. This is why, when you go back and you look at the Freedom House, the United States is ranked lower, much lower than Norway, Finland, or maybe all the European countries. And a large part of it is because Americans don't get involved in their government, and they don't get involved in their government because they don't see it as answering their needs and wants. And so here then is the final straw. This is in the end another reason, and maybe the biggest reason why this system doesn't work and why people don't buy into it. And it's the money that is awash in the system in the form of lobbying. Lobbying is influence that is put and provided on politicians in the form of cash, in the form of money for re-election. And this money is used. Different interest groups, individuals, corporations, PACs, political action committees, special interest groups, all sorts of different clientele access our politicians by providing legal donations in gigantic sums, tens, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars in some case. And they exert influence on the political process and the public policy process. It is not an automatic bribe, but it works like a bribe. If you're donating hundreds of thousands of dollars to a campaign, you are going to get public policy that benefits your situation. And that is at the core of our two-party corrupt system. Watch this little video. It should shed some light on the situation for you to try to understand the problems with lobbying and defining what it actually is.
Political system. So where is the line between lobbying and bribery? The distinction between lobbying and bribery is largely semantic. A bribe elicits an influence which is bought and paid for. For example, I'm going to give you this money and you are going to vote my way. That is illegal. Lobbying, gifts, and fundraising, on the other hand, isn't supposed to guarantee a particular response. I'm going to give you money, but you are under no obligation to vote my way. I'm just paying to gain access to you. That act is totally legal under our political system. Legal, but not without its problems. There is always the possibility that lobbyists could withhold their contributions for the next campaign if their needs are not met in this one. This is, of course, only implied, but as the rules regulating lobbyists are loosened, this implication gains strength. And the U.S. Supreme Court decided in 2010 and 2014 to eliminate some of the caps on donations from lobbyists. Critics worry that as donations grow in size, the implied threat of losing them may wield more influence. Ex-President Jimmy Carter has called the 2010 Supreme Court decision stupid, constituting legal bribery of candidates. And even if politicians are being illegally influenced by donors, proving it is difficult. A politician can always claim to have voted a certain way purely by their own choice and not because of a donor's influence. Where politicians get into trouble is when a distinct pattern emerges from that politician being paid by a donor and then immediately acting to benefit that donor. In that case, some juries will convict. That's what happened to the ex-governor of Virginia, Bob McDonnell. In January 2015, he was sentenced to prison for accepting luxury gifts and free vacations from a single donor in exchange for political access and influence. The FBI has also caught more than a few politicians through sting operations. In 2005, Louisiana Congressman William J. Jefferson was caught on video accepting a $100,000 cash bribe. Jefferson received the longest prison term for corruption ever for a U.S. congressman, 13 years. So does that mean our system is corrupt? No. Comparatively speaking, the U.S. isn't all that bad. Transparency International, a non-governmental, nonpartisan organization which ranks corruption, has the U.S. listed as 17th on their list in 2014, behind Denmark and New Zealand, but still well above other nations like China and Russia.
Okay, I want to say something here. It absolutely is corrupt. If you're 17th in the world, that goes back to the Freedom Forum as well. You know, that our democracy has all these problems. We don't want to compare ourselves with China and Russia, for God's sakes. The next time we'll be doing is comparing ourselves with North Korea. If Denmark and New Zealand can eliminate corruption in their government, then we can set laws that determine that lobbying has limits. And this has to be done if we are going to get our hands around the things that keep our government from being effective. So there you go. There you go, there you go, there you go. I think this takes care of our part 2 of our introductory unit to terms in government. And I think with part 1 and part 2, I think you got it basically on how all of this stuff works. And you look at what we've already talked about in regards to the United States of America in the 14th Amendment and its ushering in and its challenging of the civil rights movement, and a lot on how a federal government worked in balancing out states' rights in the 10th Amendment with individual rights in the 14th Amendment. And I think you can use those lessons from the civil rights movement before and beyond and today, and you can look at the levers in the structure of government. And we will keep going forward. We're going to look at the Declaration of Independence and how that bases the Constitution, how the Constitution lays out a rule book for the country, and how the amendments then protect God-given rights, and how the court system, through landmark decisions, interpret those. But at the end of the day, all of it is prefaced on the fact that you get involved in your government. Intellectually involved, that you are awake, and physically out on the street. If you don't like what you see, you go out there and challenge it. And when you become of age, you march down, you get yourself registered, you educate yourself, and you go in and pull the lever and vote. And then you get on the phone and you call your representative every single frickin' day until they do what they are supposed to do. Or you wait 2 years or 4 years or 6 years and you vote them out of office. Ta-da. Well, there we go. Part 2 is finished.